Do you have any spare change for science? In a surprise attack, Harvard had its science funding pulled by President Trump over allegations of antisemitism. Harvardians immediately told normies to call their congressman and demand taxpayer money go to Harvard so that they can continue not to get accepted by this elitist institution. Unfortunate grad students are facing an uncertain future, with stop work orders being issued on their research. But some scientists don't seem to care about Harvard not getting grants funded because they're used to seeing their grant proposals be rejected. Personally, this doesn't affect me because I was never considered Harvard material, and I'm planning on winning the lottery and financially retiring. But before I blow up and forgot where I came from, I need to find the truth. Does Harvard have the problems that they've been accused of? Am I going to be drafted into the war on science? And is an institution with a $53 billion hedge fund really a member of the victim class? I'm sure that whatever I say about this topic, no one will find it controversial or offensive. But first, what started this catfight? In a shocking turn of events that no one could have seen coming, there was turmoil in the Middle East, and for reasons I don't completely understand, people in America started getting into fights because people in not America were killing people also in not America. And at the Museum of Tolerance, fights broke out between Jews and protesters. But I didn't get into this fight because me and my homies only hang out at the Museum of Intolerance. Meanwhile, protesters protested the illegal occupation of Gaza by illegally occupying Harvard. And on campus, social justice movements started to engage in acts of social injustice. Former Harvard president Lawrence Summers was big mad after noticing that Harvard stood up for Ukraine and BLM, but didn't immediately condemn terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians, or condemn 34 student groups that wrote a letter blaming Israel for Hamas committing casual terrorism. Things came to a head when Harvard's president wasn't completely clear on whether or not the promotion of genocide was wrong. And apparently this wasn't the correct thing to do, because it turns out that there are a lot of Jews at Harvard who are not big fans of genocide. She was removed after serving the shortest presidency in Harvard's history, at which point the college investigated itself and said, hey, we might have a problem. Which anyone who has been to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting can tell you is generally the first step towards recovery. But this wasn't good enough for the Trump administration, and the president felt that the Jews didn't feel safe enough to come out of the shadows. The response was furious. In April 2025, Harvard lost $2.2 billion in federal research funding, and researchers who lost their funding immediately said that this was the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. And they constructed a website where they showed that cutting science funding would cause everyone to die. I didn't know that you could do this. Apparently, the next time I don't get my grant, it's because the government hates science. I immediately asked for a small amount of research money, but I haven't heard back from the government because we are living in a literal dictatorship. I won't name any names, but I decided to read some of the papers by the scientists complaining the loudest. And it turns out that they purposely made their research closed access, which is when academics publish something behind a paywall to prevent taxpayers from reading taxpayer-funded research. And their other papers were published in expensive journals. Money that was supposed to go to science was used to get into expensive journals just to chase clout. In other words, the same people upset about budget cuts were already wasting the budget. Because in academia, prestige matters more than being a good steward of taxpayer money. The Trump administration sent Harvard a list of demands to fix their policies or lose funding, which sounds a little bit like a ransom letter, but in reverse. In addition to the beating up Jews is bad section, they also demanded that Harvard stop being racist. Harvard had been caught being racist by the Supreme Court in 2023, when it was discovered that they were selecting people based on skin color. That's right, Harvard was discovered to be racist in a peer-reviewed science article. Harvard claimed they were being racist to reduce inequality. But strangely, when Harvard's money was diverted to less fortunate, poorer scientists, Harvard magically discovered that meritocracy was like super awesome. So, did the funding cuts affect science? I dug into Harvard's finances, and it turns out that Harvard might not have been completely honest with their statements. The old joke is that Harvard is a hedge fund with some classes in it. Harvard says they can't afford research because they only have $53 billion. In other words, if your research funding got cut, it's because Harvard didn't think your science was worth it. And if Harvard's finance people somehow don't understand this, then maybe they should fire them and hire new people from somewhere else. Even Larry Summers, former Harvard president, said part of their hedge fund's function is to be drawn down in the face of emergencies, and covering federal funding lapses surely counts as one. I tried to read his other opinions on the matter, but he put his article behind a paywall so that poor people couldn't access it. The other request in the reverse ransom letter is that the school should stop wasting so much money. Over the last 7 years, there was a 40% increase in non-faculty staff. One estimate suggested that if Harvard was a little bit more like Yale, it could save up to $650 million a year, which makes me want to conduct a study on how many non-faculty staff does it take to change a light bulb. This wasted money doesn't seem to be making its way into the salaries of the student researchers working 80 hours a week. Federal labor laws do not apply to student researchers, so they can be paid less than minimum wage. But Harvard is going to have to start getting a little more efficient because their tax-free hedge fund just got taxed, and 8% excise tax will be placed on distributions, which seems like something that would have bipartisan support. This could cost Harvard $200 million a year. We normally think of Harvard as a very prestigious institution for successful people to drop out of, with alumni who have gone on to do many notable things. But their brand took an additional hit with a notice from the government stating that they might have violated the Civil Rights Act because there might be slight racism on campus. Harvard didn't want to listen to this letter, but they would have to learn the lesson that people in the private sector have known for years. When someone gives you money, you have to do what they say. That's why Harvard is going to have a very difficult time in their negotiations with the government. Are angry mobs really going to defend a hedge fund? Without public support, their next move is going to have to be to enter in negotiations with the government, or figure out a way to survive without taxpayer funding. Did I get anything wrong? Peer review me in the comments. And remember to like and subscribe before the government shuts down my nonprofit hedge fund.